The morning sun didn't rise so much as it bled through the coastal haze, a bruised purple light that reflected off the glass-calm surface of the intracoastal waterway. On the deck of the Aegis, Elias sat in a weathered swivel chair, a steaming mug of rehydrated coffee cradled in his palms. He didn't look at the horizon. He looked at the voltage meter. The digital display glowed a soft, comforting green, 13.8 V. The Aegis was no longer the party barge it had been 3 years ago. It was a 28-foot triple pontoon, modified until it resembled something out of a naval engineer's fever dream. Overhead, a custom-built T-top frame supported 6 high-efficiency 400-watt solar panels. They overhung the sides like the brim of a giant hat, drinking in the morning rays to feed the massive lithium-ion bank tucked into the center hull. Below the waterline, the twin outboards had been replaced. In their place sat a silent, high-torque electric propulsion system. No engine roar to alert the shamblers on the shore. No oily smoke to give away their position. Just a faint, rhythmic hum of a propeller carving through salt water. Elias took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like chalk and burnt beans, but it was hot. Behind him, the sliding door to the modified cabin creaked open. Sarah stepped out, her hair pulled back in a tight braid, a tablet clutched in her hand. "How are we looking?" she asked, her voice a low rasp, a habit born from months of enforced silence. "Batteries are at 90% before the sun is even over the trees," Elias replied, gesturing to the monitor. "The fridge is holding at 38 degrees. We can run the induction heater for breakfast if you're tired of cold rations." Sarah sat on the bench seat, which had been gutted and rebuilt to house their emergency bug-out kits, waterproof tactical bags filled with ammunition, fire starters, and medical supplies. "I was reading that gardening book on the tablet last night, the one about hydroponics. If we can find a way to stabilize the pH using seawater minerals, we might not have to touch the seed kit yet." She tapped the screen of the tablet. It was her most prized non-biological possession. Contained within its solid-state drive were 10,000 e-books, medical journals, structural engineering guides, survival manuals, and a vast library of fiction to keep the madness of the silence at bay. It was their link to a dead world's collective intelligence. "The seed kit stays sealed until we find soil we can trust," Elias said firmly. "For now, we have the mountain." He looked toward the mountain, the nickname they'd given the floor-to-ceiling shelving unit bolted into the main cabin. It was packed with Mylar bags and number 10 cans of freeze-dried beef stroganoff, breakfast hash, and vegetable stir-fry. A year's worth of calories for 2 people, meticulously calculated. It was their life insurance policy, and every time Elias looked at it, he felt a cold knot of anxiety. A year sounded like a long time until you realized there was no grocery store left on Earth to restock it. The Aegis drifted a mere 100 yards from the shoreline. The shore was a jagged line of mangroves and skeletal remains of luxury condos. Somewhere in the distance, a sound drifted over the water, a wet, dragging noise, followed by a low, guttural moan that vibrated in the humid air. The echoes, that's what they call the things on land. From this distance, the zombies looked like nothing more than slow-moving shadows amongst the trees. As long as the Aegis stayed in the deep channels, the water acted as a moat. The undead didn't swim, they sank. But Elias had noticed the tides were changing, and with the tides, the drowned were beginning to wander closer to the sandbars. "We're drifting toward the oyster bar," Sarah noted, pointing her chin toward the bow. Elias stood up, setting his coffee down. He didn't use the motor. Instead, he grabbed a long carbon fiber push pole. He moved to the edge of the deck, where he had welded a series of sharpened steel rebar spikes, the Z-fences, designed to keep anything from grabbing the pontoons and climbing aboard. With a practice shove, he pressed the pole into the sandy bottom, guiding the 28-foot vessel back into the safety of the channel. As he worked, He glanced at the fishing lines trailing off astern. "Check the reels," he whispered. "If we catch a couple of snapper today, we save 2 bags of the mountain." Sarah moved to the stern, checking the heavy-duty braided lines. They had enough tackle to supply a small village, reels, lures, and nets they'd scavenged from every bait shop from Jupiter to Savannah. Out here, the ocean was the only thing still giving life, while the land only gave death. Suddenly, the line on the far left reel zapped, a sharp, violent tug that made the rod tip dance. "Got something," Sarah whispered, her eyes widening. "Big." But as she reached for the rod, she froze. Her gaze shifted past the line, toward the shoreline they had just drifted away from. A figure was standing on the edge of a collapsed pier. It wasn't a shambler. It was upright, steady, and holding something metallic that glinted in the rising sun. A pair of binoculars. The survivors weren't looking at the fish. Someone was looking at them. The glint of the binoculars on the shore acted like a cold splash of salt water. Elias dropped the push pole, the carbon fiber clattering against the aluminum deck. A sound that felt like a gunshot in the morning stillness. "Get inside," Elias hissed, his hand dropping to the holster cinched at his hip. He didn't draw the weapon, but his thumb flipped the retention strap. Sarah didn't argue. She moved with the fluid, practiced grace of someone who had spent the last year living in a space the size of a master bedroom. She retreated into the cabin, her hand hovering near the shotgun mounted just inside the door frame. From the shadows of the tinted windows, she watched the figure on the pier through her own optic, a high-powered hunting scope. "One man," she whispered, her voice transmitted via the small, battery-operated walkie-talkie clipped to Elias's shoulder. "He looks clean. Too clean. He's wearing a tactical vest. Tan. He's not moving." Elias stayed low, using the mountain of food crates visible through the cabin door as a psychological shield. He looked at the solar monitor again. The sun was higher now. The panels hummed with invisible energy, but he felt exposed. The Aegis was a floating jewel, a gold mine of calories, clean water, and power. To anyone on the shore, they weren't just survivors. They were a supply drop. "Is he alone?" Elias asked. "Scanning. I don't see anyone else on the pier. But there's a skiff tucked into the mangroves about 50 yards south of him. A flat bottom. He's got an outboard on it." The mention of the outboard changed everything. If the stranger had fuel in a boat, the moat was gone. The distance that kept them safe from the shamblers was irrelevant against a human with a motor. "He's waving," Sarah said, her voice tightening. "White cloth. He's holding up a white cloth." "Doesn't matter," Elias replied. "We don't do neighbors. Not anymore." He crawled toward the helm. The electric motor controls were a simple joystick and a digital throttle. He didn't want to make a run for it, yet running used a battery, and while they were at 90%, he hated wasting fuel on a whim. He engaged the bow thruster, a small electric fan in the front hull that allowed the pontoon to spin on its axis. The Aegis groaned softly as it rotated, the sharpened rebar spikes on the hull slicing through the air. Elias kept his eyes on the man. The stranger had lowered the binoculars and was now gesturing toward the south, toward the open bay. "Sarah, look at what he's pointing at," Elias commanded. There was a long silence. Then, the sound of the tablet's case snapping shut. "Elias, he's not pointing at us. He's pointing at the bridge, the drawbridge at the inlet." Elias risked a glance over the railing. 3 miles south, the massive concrete span of the Bella Vista Bridge rose out of the water. It was supposed to be locked in the up position to prevent the shamblers from crossing from the mainland to the barrier islands. Through the haze, Elias saw it. The bridge wasn't up. It was halfway down, jammed at a 45-degree angle. And it was covered, a dark, undulating mass was spilling off the edge of the bridge like a slow-motion waterfall of charcoal. It took Elias's brain a second to process what he was seeing. It was a spill. A massive herd of the undead, thousands of them, had been pushed or lured onto the bridge. With the span partially lowered, they were falling into the channel, the very channel the Aegis was currently anchored in. They're in the water, Elias breathed. They don't swim. Elias, you said so yourself, Sarah said, though her voice wavered. They don't have to swim if there's enough of them to carpet the bottom. Elias snapped. The tide is coming in. It's pushing that mass right toward the sandbar. They'll be under us in 20 minutes. If they catch the pontoons, they'll weigh us down until the whole swamp. The man on the shore wasn't a threat. He was a warning. He waved the white cloth one last time, then turned and vanished into mangroves, heading for his skiff. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an exit. Elias slammed the throttle forward. The electric motors whined, a high-pitched zip that sent a ripple of white water trailing behind the triple hulls. "Secure the deck," Elias shouted. "Everything that isn't bolted down goes in the lockers. I'm taking us into the chop." Sarah moved like a whirlwind. The fishing rods, one still bent double with whatever creature was on line, were yanked from their holders. She didn't have time to reel in. She pulled a serrated deck knife and sliced a heavy braid. Zing! The line vanished into the depths, a sacrifice to the sea. She scrambled to the solar-powered radio, clicking it over to the emergency band, scanning for any chatter. Static, always static. She grabbed the tablet and the chargers, shoving them into the Faraday bag tucked under the helm. The Aegis picked up speed, hitting 6 knots, then 8. The pontoons began to whistle as they cut through the brine. Elias steered them away from the shore, aiming for the center of the deep water channel. As they neared the bend, Elias looked down into the water. Usually it was a clear, turquoise green. Today, it was a murky, churning brown. Then he saw a hand. It broke the surface 3 feet from the starboard hull. A gray, bloated thing with fingernails worn down to the bone. It didn't reach for them. It was simply being carried by the current, part of a submerged carpet of death moving beneath the boat. Then another appeared. Then a head, the hair flowing like seaweed, the jaw hanging open in a silent underwater scream. The drowned were being pushed by the tide, a literal river of corpses filling the channel from bank to bank. One of them hit the propeller. Sarah yelled, feeling the vibration through the floorboards. The boat shuddered. The electric motor hummed lower, struggling against a sudden resistance. Elias watched the amperage draw spike on the monitor. 50A, 80A, 110A. I have to reverse it to clear the debris. Elias yelled. He slammed the motor into reverse, then forward, then reverse again. A cloud of dark, tattered clothing in red-black gore erupted from the stern. The vibration ceased, and the Aegis leapt forward again, free. They cleared the bend and saw the open ocean. The Atlantic was a deep, unforgiving blue, capped with white peaks. To the left and right, the coast was a funeral pyre of smoke and ruin. Elias didn't stop until the shore was a thin, jagged line on the horizon. He cut the motors and the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. The safe rhythm of their life near the shore was gone. He looked at Sarah. She was leaning against the cabin door. The tablet clutched to her chest like a talisman. "We can't go back," she said quietly. "The channel is choked. We're out here now." Elias looked at the mountain of food through the window, then at the seed kit tucked in its waterproof box. He looked at the solar panels, still drinking in the sun, indifferent to the horror in the water. "We have the food," Elias said, his voice hardening. "We have the power. We have the library." He looked out at the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic. "We just have to see who runs out of world first." Us or them. The Aegis sat 3 miles offshore, anchored in 60 feet of water over a limestone reef. To Elias, the distance felt like a warm blanket. Out here, the only sounds were the rhythmic slap-slap of waves against the aluminum hulls and the occasional cry of a hovering gull. He was currently crouched on the aft deck, performing the ritual that kept the salt that sought-after bay. He held a pressurized sprayer filled with precious fresh water. Sourced from the solar still, he'd rigged over the bow and was meticulously rinsing the seals of the electric outboards. He didn't just spray, he wiped every inch with a microfiber cloth. To Elias, a speck of corrosion was a crack in their armor. "The seal on the fridge is holding," Sarah called out from the cabin. She was sitting at the small dinette, the tablet propped up in front of her. "I've been logging the power draw. Even with the induction stove running this morning, the lithium bank is back to 100%. We're overflowing with power. Elias, it's almost a waste." Elias stepped into the cabin, wiping his hands. The interior was a masterpiece of organization. Every square inch had a purpose. The e-books on the tablet were their entertainment, but the physical reality of their world was the mountain. They had recently moved 3 months' worth of freeze-dried pouches into the underfloor storage to lower the boat's center of gravity for the ocean swells. "It's not a waste," Elias said, looking at the tablet. "It means we can run the UV water purifier for an extra cycle. I want the holding tank scrubbed. I don't want a single microbe in our drinking water. We can't afford to get sick." He looked over her shoulder at the screen. She wasn't reading a novel. She was looking at a high-resolution map of the coastline they had downloaded before the satellites went dark. "I've been thinking about the drown we saw in the channel," Sarah said, her finger tracing the jagged line of the shore. "If they're filling the waterways, they're eventually going to wash out the inlets. The tides will pull them out to sea." "They'll sink," Elias said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Without air in their lungs, they're just dead weight. The pressure will crush them or the sharks will take them." "Maybe," Sarah whispered. "But look at the reef we're over. It's shallow enough for them to stand if they wash up on a sandbar. We need to be careful about where we anchor at night. We're not as untouchable as we think." She was right. The ocean was big, but the drowned were numerous. To break the tension, Sarah pulled a vacuum-sealed bag from the mountain. Beef stroganoff. It was a luxury. They had spent the afternoon catching yellowtail snapper, which they had pan-seared on the electric griddle, saving the freeze-dried meal for a Saturday treat. Even though days had long since lost their names. As the induction heater hummed, Elias stepped back out to the helm. He picked up his binoculars and scanned the horizon. The mainland was a hazy silhouette of dead skyscrapers and blackened forests. But as he panned the lenses toward a nearby navigational buoy, a massive steel bell marked red 4. He saw something that made his heart stutter. The buoy was leaning. Something was clinging to it. He adjusted the focus. It wasn't one thing. It was 3. They were gray-skinned, their clothes reduced to salt-caked rags. They had tangled themselves in the iron lattice of the buoy. As the buoy rocked in the swells, the figures swayed with it, their dead eyes staring blankly toward the Aegis. They weren't moving, but they weren't gone. They were hibernating in the salt, waiting for a vibration, a sound, or smell. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice flat, "bring the binoculars and the long gaff." They watched the buoy for an hour. The infected on the buoy didn't scream. They didn't moan. They were silent sentinels, hitchhiking on the ocean's currents. "If they can cling to a buoy," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "they can cling to our anchor line." The realization hit like a physical blow. The anchor line was their only connection to the earth. It was a 100-foot umbilical cord, made of braided nylon. To a drowned drifting in the dark, it was a ladder. "We need to modify the line," Elias said, already moving toward the tool locker. We have the spare rebar from the hull spikes. I'm going to build a descender, a weighted cone that sits 10 feet below the surface on the rope. If anything tries to climb up, they hit a circle of outward-facing spikes. He worked through the afternoon, the sound of his hacksaw rhythmic and determined. He wasn't just building a spike. He was venting his frustration. He hated that the land was following them. He hated that the ocean wasn't the hard reset he had hoped for. By sunset, the anchor guard was installed. It looked like a medieval crown of thorns made of sharpened steel, clamped firmly around the thick nylon rope. As the sun began to dip, painting the Atlantic in shades of gold and blood orange, Elias sat back in his chair. He turned on the solar-powered radio, slowly turning the dial through the static. Usually there was nothing, but tonight, beneath the hiss of atmospheric interference, there was a rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. Is that a heartbeat? Sarah asked, standing by the cabin door. No, Elias said, his eyes fixed on the darkening shore. That's a drum. Someone on the beach is beating a drum. It was a primitive, hollow sound. It wasn't a distress signal. It was a call, and as the wind shifted, carrying the sound further out to sea, they heard the response. From the water, not a drum, but a splash, then another. Somewhere in the dark between the Aegis and the shore, something was breaking the surface. Get the floodlights, Elias commanded, and don't turn them on until I tell you. I want to see how many of them are out there before they see us. He reached for the tablet, not for a book, but to check the Aegis's perimeter sensors he'd rigged to the hull, simple vibration triggers. The screen flickered. A red began to pulse on the bow. Something was knocking on the hull. Elias didn't move. He held his breath, his eyes locked on a red pulse on the tablet screen. The vibration wasn't a sharp, metallic strike of a tool or a weapon. It was a dull, rhythmic thud, like a heavy bag of wet sand bumping against the aluminum pontoon. Thump, slide, thump. Sarah, the light? Elias whispered. Low beam. Port side forward. Sarah clicked the heavy-duty waterproof flashlight on, instead of a wide searchlight beam. She kept her hand hooded over the lens, allowing only a narrow sliver of LED light to cut through the darkness. The beam hit the water, illuminating the frothing brine between the center and port pontoons. The water was thick with sea grapes, clusters of floating, bulbous kelp that often drifted out from the estuaries. But tucked amongst the weed was a pale, bloated arm. The creature wasn't trying to climb. Not yet. It was entangled in the very Z-spikes Elias had welded to the hull for protection. The sharpened rebar had pierced through the creature's waterlogged shoulder, pinning it against the boat. As the Aegis rocked in the swells, the spike tore deeper into the dead tissue, and the creature's head lolled back, its jaw missing, its eyes replaced by the milky film of salt rot. It's just a drifter, Sarah breathed, her relief audible. It got caught on the spikes. Elias watched the way the body moved. It wasn't kicking, but its fingers were twitching, scraping uselessly against the metal. The tide brought it right to us. If one got caught, there are more in the stream. He grabbed a long gaff, a 6-foot pole with a wicked stainless steel hook at the end. He reached over the railing, the muscles in his forearms bunching as he pushed the hook into the creature's chest. With a grunt of effort, he levered the body off the spike. The corpse slid back into the black water with a heavy splash, vanishing instantly into the depths. We're moving, Elias said, wiping the gaff head with a bleach-soaked rag. I don't care if it wastes the battery. I'm not sleeping over a graveyard. He climbed to the helm and engaged the electric motors. The silent thrust pushed them forward, cutting through the dark. He steered them another 2 miles out until the depth sounder read 120 feet. Here, the current was stronger, pushing toward the north. He dropped the anchor again, hearing the clack, clack, clack of the chain until the anchor guard spike cone disappeared beneath the surface. To settle their nerves, they retreated into the cabin. The interior of the Aegis was their sanctuary. Elias turned on a small, warm-toned LED strip. The light reflected off the organized rows of their library, the tablet, a few waterproof physical journals, and the thick, plastic-bound master manual Elias had printed before the fall. "Let's check the stores," Sarah said, a common tactic to ground themselves. She opened the floor hatch. Underneath the marine-grade plywood sat the heart of their survival. Row after row of Mylar bags, color-coded by meal type. Yellow, breakfast, granola, eggs, biscuits, and gravy. Red, high-protein meats. Blue, vegetables and fruits. "We've only used 14 days' worth of the mountain since we left the shore," Sarah noted, tapping a tally into her spreadsheet on the tablet. "And with the fish we've been catching, we've actually extended our window. If we stay disciplined, we have 14 months, not 12. Elias nodded, but his eyes were on the electronics. He pulled a small handheld multimeter from his pocket and began checking the terminals on their backup battery bank. Everything was pristine. The high-end solar controllers were humming, their cooling fan silent, because they weren't using a noisy gas generator. There was no vibration to shake the sensitive solder joints. The boat was, for all intents and purposes, a floating laboratory. "We have the seeds, too," Elias muttered, looking at the pelican case tucked in the corner. "If we find an island, a real one with high ground and a spring—" "We stay on the boat, Elias," Sarah interrupted gently. "Land is where the noise is. Land is where the hunger is. Out here we're ghosts. Ghosts don't get eaten." They spent the next few hours in the ritual of the New World Night. Sarah scrolled to the tablet, reading an old textbook on marine biology, try to understand if the salt would eventually dissolve the infected or just preserve them like jerky. Elias sat by the window, his night vision monocular pressed to his eye, watching the distant, dark silhouette of the world. Around 3 a.m., the wind died down completely. The ocean became a black mirror. Elias was about to head to his bunk when a faint chirp came from a radio. He left it on the scan setting, though it usually only found white noise. "If anyone, latitude 27. The voice was thin, shredded by distance and interference. Sarah jumped up, her eyes wide. "Is that a person?" Elias reached for the mic, but his hand stopped an inch away. He remembered the man on the pier. He remembered the drum he'd heard earlier. "We are the Marlowe. Engine dead. Drifting, please." "The Marlowe," Sarah whispered. "That's a research vessel. I saw it in the marina months ago. It's huge, Elias. It has a desalination plant. It has medical bays." Elias looked at his power monitor. 100%. He looked at his electric motors. Perfect condition. He looked at the mountain. They had everything they needed. "If they're drifting, they're a target," Elias said. "A boat that big is a dinner bell. We go near that, we lose our invisibility." "They said medical bays, Elias," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a plea. "Your leg. The infection from the reef scratch. If it turns into sepsis, all the freeze-dried food in the world won't save you." Elias looked down at his calf. Under the denim of his work pants, a red streak was beginning to climb toward his knee. He'd hidden it for 3 days, treating it with basic antiseptic, but the salt and the heat were winning. He needed real antibiotics, the kind a research vessel would carry. He looked back at the radio. The signal drifted in and out, a ghost seeking a haunt. "We don't board," Elias cautioned. "We approach, we trade, we leave. If anything looks wrong, I'm cutting the line." He turned the key. The electric motors woke with a soft, predatory whine. The Aegis began to turn, its bow pointing toward the coordinates whispered through the static. As they moved through the water, the anchor guard was hauled up, dripping and clean. No drown had hitched a ride tonight. But as they headed deeper into the Atlantic, away from their safe reef, the Aegis felt smaller than it ever had before. The electronics were green. The food was plenty. But for the first time in a year, they were heading toward the one thing more dangerous than the dead, a reason to hope. Part 3. The Ghost Ship, Segment 1 of 2. The Marlowe did not look like a ship. In the pre-dawn gloom, it looked like a jagged island of rusted steel, rising 60 feet out of the Atlantic. It was a 200-foot oceanographic research vessel, once white and gleaming, now streaked with the orange tears of oxidation and the green slime of bird guano. It sat heavy in the water, dead adrift, listing 3 degrees to the starboard side. Elias cut the Aegis's motors a quarter-mile out. He didn't want the hum of propellers, however quiet, to telegraph their arrival. "See anything?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the lap of the waves. Sarah was at the bow. The night vision monocular pressed her eye. The world through the lens was a grainy, glowing emerald. No movement on the bridge. No lights in the portholes. "It's a tomb, Elias. If there's anyone left alive on that thing, they're hiding deep." Elias felt a throb in his leg, a hot, pulsing reminder of why they were here. The red streak had reached his mid-thigh. He'd spent the morning looking at the medical PDFs on the tablet, and the prognosis wasn't good. Without a heavy course of intravenous antibiotics or high-grade oral ciprofloxacin, he was 10 days away from a fever he wouldn't wake up from. "Check the sensors," Elias commanded. Sarah tapped the tablet. The Aegis was equipped with a forward-looking infrared FLIR camera Elias had salvaged from a decommissioned police boat. The screen showed the Marlowe as a cold blue silhouette. "No heat signatures on the hull," she reported. "Wait! There, near the waterline, aft, there's a faint orange glow. Someone's running a small heater or a lamp in the lower galley." The radio signal came from somewhere, Elias muttered. He checked his gear. He wore a reinforced tactical vest, a suppressed 9mm pistol on his hip, and a heavy-duty crowbar looped through his belt. He didn't want to shoot. Noise was a beacon, but he wasn't going in soft. He engaged the bow thrusters, nudging the pontoon closer. The Aegis looked like a toy next to the Marlowe. The triple hulls of their boat were clean, the solar panels glinting like obsidian, while the research ship was a graveyard of barnacles and peeling paint. As they drifted alongside the massive steel hull, Elias reached out and touched the Marlowe. The metal was cold and vibrated with a low, subharmonic groan as the two vessels bumped together. "Stay with the boat," Elias said, handing Sarah the remote for the electric windlass. "Keep the motors hot. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, or if you see anything come over that railing, you cut the lines and you head for the deep water. Don't wait for me." "Elias, the mountain is yours, Sarah. The tablet is yours. You know how to maintain the solar bank. You don't die for a man who's already rotting." He didn't wait for her to argue. He grabbed a rope ladder they'd rigged and hooked it into a rusted scupper hole on the Marlowe's deck. He climbed, his legs screaming in protest with every rung. He rolled over the railing and onto the deck of the research ship. The smell hit him instantly, a mixture of stale diesel, rotting kelp, and the unmistakable sweet copper tang of old blood. The deck was a chaotic mess of overturned equipment. Deep-sea probes and sonar, buoys lay scattered like giant, broken toys. Elias stayed low, moving toward the primary superstructure. He kept his back to the bulkheads, his eyes scanning the shadows. The silence was absolute, save for the wind whistling through the ship's rigging. He found the hatch to the medical bay on the second level. It was made of heavy, reinforced steel. It was locked from the inside. Clang, clang, clang. Elias tapped the crowbar against the door. "I'm responding to the radio signal," he called out, his voice sounding thin in the cavernous hallway. "I have trade. Food for medicine. I'm alone." A long silence followed. Then, the sound of heavy bolts being thrown. The door creaked open 6 inches. A face appeared in the gap. Gaunt, pale, with eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a full night's sleep in a year. It was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, wearing a stained lab coat. "Did you bring the food?" she whispered. "I have a year's worth on my boat," Elias said, which was a lie. He had more, but he wasn't giving her the full count. "I have freeze-dried meals, vacuum-sealed, but I need antibiotics. Broad spectrum." The woman looked past him, her eyes searching the empty deck. "You're on a pontoon. We saw you on the radar before the power failed. How is it still running? How is it so clean?" "Solar," Elias said shortly. "Now, the medicine. Do you have it?" The woman's expression shifted from desperation to a terrifying kind of hunger. Not the hunger of the infected, but the hunger of the lost. "We have the infirmary. We have everything. But the Marlowe isn't empty, mister." Elias, "I'm Dr. Aegis. We have the medicine, but we can't get to the main storage. The lower decks, they didn't clear out when the infection hit. The crew, they're still down there, in the dark, and they found a way to stairs." Elias felt the hair on his neck stand up. "You call for help just to use me as a bait dog?" "No," she hissed, grabbing his sleeve. "I call because we're starving. If you help me clear the path to the cold storage, I'll give you enough Cipro to last a lifetime, and I'll give you something else. The Marlowe's charts. We found an island, Elias, a real one. No shamblers, no spill, but we can't get there without a motor that works." She looked at him with feverish intensity. "Help me, and we both get off this rust bucket." Before Elias could answer, a sound echoed from the deck below. A wet, slapping sound. Slap, drag, slap. It was coming from the stairs. And it wasn't just one. Elias didn't hesitate. He shoved Dr. Aegis back into the infirmary and stepped in after her, pulling the heavy steel door shut just as a weight slammed against the other side. The metal boomed like a drum. "How many?" Elias demanded, his voice a low growl. He ignored the throbbing heat in his leg, forcing his focus onto the door. 10? 12? "I don't know," Aegis stumbled, leaning against a surgical table. The crew was 40 strong. Most went overboard during the first week, but the ones in the engine room, they were trapped. They're different, Elias. The salt, the lack of sun, they're like husks. Another thud shook the door. Then a horrific, wet scratching sound. Fingernails on steel. Elias scanned the room. The infirmary was a treasure trove. Stainless steel cabinets were filled with glass vials, rolls of gauze, and surgical kits. In a world where a paper cut could be a death sentence, this room was a cathedral. "Where's the Cipro?" Elias asked, stepping toward a cabinet marked with a red cross, locked in the floor safe. "The key is in the captain's office, 1 deck up," she said, her voice trembling. "But the medicine isn't the problem. Look." She pointed to a monitor on the wall, powered by a flickering daisy-chain battery. It was a closed circuit feed of the aft deck. Elias felt his stomach drop. On the screen, he saw the Aegis. It looked like a pristine white lily floating in a gutter. But it wasn't alone. 3 shapes were clinging to the side of the pontoon hulls. They had drifted over from the Marlowe's rusted waterline, attracted by the vibration of the Aegis's station-keeping thrusters. "Sarah," Elias hissed into his radio. "Sarah, do you copy? You have boarders. Port side." Static. The Marlowe's massive steel superstructure was acting as a Faraday cage, shredding his signal. "I have to go," Elias said, turning toward the door. "You'll never make it to the railing." Aegis cried, "They're in the hall." "Take the ventilation shaft. It leads to the bridge. You can jump to the canopy of your boat from there." Elias looked at the doctor. She was terrified, but she was holding a heavy medical bag. She'd already packed what she could. "The charts," Elias said. "Give me the coordinates for that island." She reached into her lab coat and pulled out a ruggedized flash drive and a crumpled piece of paper. "It's a research station on a volcanic outcrop. Freshwater springs, sheer cliffs. The infected can't climb it. We were heading there when the fuel pumps failed." Elias grabbed the paper, shoving it into his pocket. He kicked a plastic chair over to the vent on the wall. With a few violent tugs of the crowbar, the grate screeched and popped off. "You first," Elias commanded. They scrambled into the narrow, galvanized tunnel. It smelled of cold grease and old air. Elias crawled behind her, his infected leg dragging. Every movement a localized explosion of pain. Below them, through the thin metal of the ducts, he could hear the hiss-click of the things in the hallway. They weren't moaning like the shamblers on land. They were making a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. They reached the bridge access 10 minutes later. Elias kicked the exit hatch open and tumbled onto the bridge floor. The glass was shattered, the expensive navigation screen smashed. He looked out the windows. Below, 30 feet down, the Aegis was fighting for its life. Sarah was on the deck, wielding the long gaff. She was stabbing downward, trying to push a gray, barnacle-encrusted figure off the solar panel overhang. Another one was halfway over the Z-spikes, its torso impaled, but its arms still reaching for her ankles. "Sarah!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking. She looked up, her face a mask of pure terror. "Elias, I can't hold the line. There are more coming up the anchor chain." Elias turned to Dr. Aegis. "Stay here. If I clear the deck, you jump. Do you hear me?" He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't use the ladder. He climbed onto the railing of the Marlowe and looked at the blue-tinted solar panels of his own boat. It was a 20-foot drop. He leapt. The air rushed past him, a cold streak of salt and wind. He landed hard on the reinforced T-top frame. The solar panels groaned under his weight, but the aluminum held. He didn't stop to check for broken bones. He slid down the support pole, landing on the deck right behind the creature that was reaching for Sarah. He didn't use his gun. He swung the crowbar with the weight of a year's worth of bottled-up rage. The curve then caught the creature in the base of the skull. There was a sound like a dry branch snapping, and the body slumped over the side, sliding off the spikes and back into the dark Atlantic. "Elias!" Sarah sobbed, lunging for him, but he pushed her toward the helm. "Get us moving. North-northwest. Max throttle." He turned to the railing. Another drowned was pulling itself up the anchor line, its fingers hooked into the braided nylon. Elias didn't try to fight it. He grabbed the emergency axe from the helm station and brought it down on the rope. Snap! The tension in the line released with the sound of a whip crack. The anchor guard spikes, and the climbing corpse vanished into the 100-foot depths. "Jump!" Elias roared at the Marlowe. Dr. Aegis appeared at the railing. She hesitated for a heartbeat, looking at the churning white water as the Aegis's electric motors began to scream. She threw her medical bag first. It landed on the deck with a heavy thud. And then she jumped. She hit the water 6 feet from the boat. "Reverse!" Elias yelled. Sarah slammed the joystick back. The Aegis groaned, the propeller's cavitation burning the water. Elias leaned over the Z-spikes, grabbing the doctor by the collar of her lab coat and hauling her onto the deck like a landed fish. They didn't look back. The Aegis surged forward, the electric motors drawing massive amounts of power, pulling them away from the rusted hull of the Marlow. As the research ship faded into the morning mist, the deck of the Aegis was a mess of salt, blood, and broken rope. Elias slumped against a mountain of food, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she ripped open his pant leg. The red streak was now inches from his groin. "The bag!" Elias wheezed, pointing to the doctor's satchel. "See what she brought." Sarah unzipped the bag. Inside, nestled among the vials, were 6 boxes of medical-grade antibiotics and a surgical kit. But there was something else. A small, refrigerated container powered by a battery pack. Sarah opened it and went pale. "Elias, these aren't just medicines." She held up a vial. "It's a log. They were testing the drowned on the Marlow. They weren't just survivors. Elias, they were researchers." Dr. Aegis sat up, coughing up seawater, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "The island," she gasped. "The coordinates I gave you. It's not just a sanctuary. It's the last place the samples are safe. We have to get there before the batteries in that cooler die." Elias looked at the Aegis. Their boat was still perfect. Their food was still plenty, but their silence was gone. They had a passenger, a mission, and a map to a place that might be the end of the world, or the start of a new one. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice regaining its steel, "check the solar levels. We're going to be running hard for the next 3 days." He looked at the doctor, then at the vast, empty ocean. "Welcome to the Aegis," he said grimly. "Don't touch the food without asking." The horizon was a perfect, unbroken circle. For the first time since the world ended, there was no smoke on the breeze, no silhouette of a ruined skyscraper, and no sound of the echoes on the shore. There was only the Aegis and the infinite, rolling hills of the Atlantic. It had been 4 days since they fled the Marlow. Elias lay on the aft deck under a makeshift canopy. The fever had broken 36 hours ago, thanks to the intravenous ciprofloxacin Dr. Aegis had administered. He was weak, his skin sallow, but the red line on his leg had retreated. He spent his hours staring at the solar panels above him, watching the way they tilted automatically to track the sun, a masterpiece of pre-collapse engineering that was now keeping 3 people alive. "You're staring at the voltmeter again," Sarah said, stepping over a coil of rope. She looked tired. The dark circles under her eyes weren't just from lack of sleep. They were from the constant, low-level vibration of having a stranger in their sanctuary. 14.2, Elias whispered. "The batteries are full. We're pushing 10 knots on the electric drive, and we're still gaining a net charge. The boat is fine, Sarah." "The boat is fine," she agreed, sitting beside him. "The mount isn't." She handed him the tablet. The spreadsheet was open. With Dr. Aegis on board, their year of food had been slashed by a third. "We're down to 240 days of full rations," Sarah said. "That's if we don't catch any fish. And out here in the deep blue, there's nothing but sargassum weed and the occasional mahi-mahi. The reef fish are gone." Elias looked toward the bow. Dr. Aegis was sitting there, the refrigerated medical case tucked between her feet. She hadn't let it out of her sight for a single second. She was a ghost in a lab coat, staring at the GPS coordinates on a handheld unit, murmuring to herself. "She eats like a bird, at least," Elias muttered. "She eats our calories, Elias. And she uses our fresh water to wash her hands every 20 minutes. She's a clinical neat freak in a world made of rot. It's a waste of the solar still's output." Elias sat up, his muscles groaning. He grabbed the railing and pulled himself to his feet. The Aegis felt different with a third body. The weight distribution was off by a fraction. The boat sat a quarter-inch lower in the water. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Elias, it was a flaw. He limped toward the bow. Dr. Aegis didn't look up until his shadow fell over her. "How's the leg?" she asked, her voice professional and detached. "It works. Now tell me about the island." Elias said, "We've been heading north-northwest for 96 hours. We're over the abyssal plain. There shouldn't be anything out here but water." Eris finally looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot. "It's a volcanic pillar. It doesn't show up on most civilian charts because it was a private research site, Project Solstice. It's an upwelling. The cold water from the deep hits the pillar and brings nutrients to the surface. It's a closed ecosystem. And the samples?" Elias gestured to the cooler. "You said they were safe." "Safe for who?" Eris hesitated. She reached out and touched the lid of the cooler. "On the Marlow, we weren't just looking for a cure. We were looking for the trigger. The infection isn't a fungus or a standard virus. Elias. It's a protein fold, a prion that reacts to certain sound frequencies. That's why they moan. That's why they follow the drums." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "You're saying they're being steered." "I'm saying they're capable of being coordinated." Eris corrected. "The samples in this box are the primal strain. If we get them to the lab on the island, we can broadcast a null frequency. We can't kill them, but we can make them stop. We can make them sit down and wait until they rot away into nothing." Elias looked back at Sarah, who was watching them from the helm. She was holding the tablet. Their library of 10,000 books, their history, their escape. "You're talking about a reset button," Elias said. "I'm talking about a future where you don't have to live on a pontoon boat." Eris snapped. Suddenly, the Aegis jerked violently to the left. The electric motors screamed, a high-pitched whine of sudden resistance. "Elias!" Sarah yelled. "The depth sounder. It's gone from 4,000 feet to 20. Elias scrambled to the helm. His leg forgotten, he looked at the sonar. The screen was a solid block of yellow. "We're not over a reef," Elias said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The GPS says we're in the middle of the deep." He looked over the side. The water wasn't blue anymore. It was brown. A massive, floating mat of sargassum seaweed, miles wide, was clogging the ocean surface. It was so thick it looked like solid ground. But it wasn't just weed. Tangled in the vines were thousands of plastic bottles, crates, pieces of driftwood, and more terrifyingly, bloated gray shapes. The Aegis hadn't hit a reef. It had run aground on a floating island of trash and the dead. The motors, Elias shouted. "Kill the motors before the weed chokes the intakes." Sarah slammed the kill switch, but was too late. A sickening thud crunch echoed through the hulls. The Aegis shuddered and came to a dead stop, pinned in the heart of a plastic graveyard. Elias looked over the side, his stomach twisting. The sargassum was a dense, golden-brown carpet, knit together by decades of discarded fishing nets, plastic crates, and heavy nylon ropes. It was a garbage patch, a gyre where the ocean's currents deposited the world's filth. And because the drowned didn't decompose like normal bodies in the salt, the patch had become a floating raft for the dead. "The props are fouled," Elias said, his voice tight. "Sarah, get the long-handled shears. Eris, get on the binoculars. If anything moves in that weed, I need to know 5 seconds before it reaches the hulls." He didn't wait for them to move. He grabbed a safety line, clipped it to his belt, and leaned over the aft deck. The electric motors were tilted up out of the water, revealing a nightmare of thick, black nylon rope and slimy kelp choked tight around the stainless steel propellers. "It's a ghost net," Elias cursed. The motor's torque just sucked it right in. He began to hack at the mess. The Aegis groaned as a swell passed on the trash island, the hulls grinding against plastic drums. Every movement felt sluggish. They were no longer floating. They were being absorbed. "Elias," Sarah whispered from the bow. She wasn't holding the shears. She was holding the shotgun. "We have company. 10 o'clock. Elias looked up, wiping salt and grease from his forehead. 50 yards away, A cluster of orange life vests was bobbing in the weed. At first, they looked like simple debris. Then one of them turned. The drowned inside the vest was little more than a skeleton held together by leathery skin and salt-cured muscle. Its jaw was gone, but its arms were moving, clawing at the seaweed to pull itself toward the vibration of the Aegis. Then another vest moved. Then a third. "They're trapped in the patch," Aegis said, her voice trembling as she clutched her medical cooler. "The vests keep them buoyant. They've been drifting here for years." "They're not just drifting," Elias noted, his eyes narrowing. "The tide is compressing the patch. The whole mat is moving toward the center. It's bringing them right to us." He doubled his pace, the shears snicking through the heavy nylon rope. His infected leg throbbed, a dull reminder of his mortality. He chopped away a massive hunk of net, and one of the propellers spun free. "One side is clear," he yelled. Thump. The boat shuddered. A drowned, its skin the color of wet parchment, had reached the port pontoon. It didn't have the strength to climb the Z-spikes, but it didn't need to. It simply hung there, its weight adding to the drag, its fingers hooking into the aluminum trim. "Don't shoot." Elias barked as Sarah raised a shotgun. "The noise will bring every drifter within 5 miles. Use the gaff." Sarah lunged forward, the stainless steel hook catching the creature in the shoulder. She shoved, her boots skidding on the clean deck. With a grunt, she levered the thing back into the golden weed. Elias slashed the last of the rope from the second motor. "Clear. Sarah, get to the helm. Aegis, use the push pole. We need to find a river in the weed. Any blue water." Sarah slammed the throttle forward. The electric motors hummed, the sound muffled by the thick sludge of the garbage patch. The Aegis moved, but it was like dragging a sled through wet concrete. The hulls shrieked as they slid over a submerged shipping container. "Left! Go left!" Aegis shouted, pointing toward a thin vein of dark blue water 100 yards away. The Aegis surged, the high-torque electric motors proving their worth. They pushed through a wall of plastic bottles, the Z-spikes, on the bow acting like a prow to part the trash. Another pair drowned reached for the railing, but the speed of the boat, even at a measly 4 knots, was enough to tumble them back into the wake. With one final violent lurch, the pontoons cleared the edge of the mat. The brown sludge gave way to the deep, sapphire blue of the open Atlantic. "Don't stop," Elias yelled, even as the boat picked up speed. "Give it full power for 10 minutes. I want that graveyard over the horizon." They ran until the garbage patch was nothing more than a thin, dirty line on the rear view. Only then did Sarah throttle back to a sustainable cruising speed. The deck of the Aegis was no longer pristine. It was covered in bits of black nylon, stinking kelp, and a single salt-crusted human finger that had snagged on the railing. Elias kicked the debris overboard and began hosing down the deck with the salt water pump. "We lost a lot of power in that sprint," Sarah said, checking the monitors. "The batteries are down to 60%, and the port side hull has a dent. Not a breach, but it's there." Elias looked at the dent. It was a battle scar. For the first time, the Aegis looked like a survival vessel instead of a showroom boat. "We're still floating," Elias said. He looked at Aegis. "And we're still moving toward your island. But no more secrets. Doctor, if that island isn't there, or if it's overrun, we're turning this boat around and heading for the deep. We have 230 days of food left. I'm not spending the last of them on a fool's errand." Aegis nodded, her face pale. She opened her cooler, checking the internal temperature. "The island is there, Elias, and it has what we need. But you should know, the reason the Marlowe left was because they detected a pulse coming from that coordinate. Something is broadcasting." Elias looked at the tablet, the 10,000 books, and the quiet, high-tech sanctuary they had built. "Then let's hope it's a welcome," he said. Part 5, The Pillar of Salt, Segment 1 of 2. On the 7th day after leaving the garbage patch, the horizon finally broke its flat blue line. At first, it looked like a low-hanging cloud, but as the Aegis drew closer, the silhouette sharpened into jagged, emerald green peaks of St. Jude's Spire. It was a volcanic outcrop, barely 3 miles wide, but it rose steeply from the sea. Half the island was a sheer basalt cliff. The other half was a gentle slope of white sand and palm trees that sheltered the Solstice Reef Resort. "Look at the glass," Sarah whispered, handing the binoculars to Elias. Even from a mile out, the resort's central pavilion was visible. It was a masterpiece of tropical architecture, soaring wooden beams and floor-to-ceiling windows. Most of the glass was intact, reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon. There was no smoke, no flickering fires. "The dock is still standing," Elias noted, his eyes tracking the long, concrete pier that extended into the turquoise lagoon. "But look at the shoreline. See those dark clusters?" Sarah squinted, scattered along the pristine white beach with familiar gray shapes. "They're spread out, maybe 50, 100. The drown didn't start here," Dr. Aegis said, leaning over the railing. She looked at the GPS. "The current pulls from the mainland directly toward this reef. They washed up here. They took the resort by surprise because they came from the one place the guests weren't looking, the water." Elias turned the Aegis toward the lagoon. The electric motors were silent, allowing the boat to glide over the crystal-clear coral like a ghost. He kept his hand on the throttle, ready to reverse at the first sign of a spill. "We don't dock at the pier," Elias commanded. "We anchor 50 yards out. We use the gaffs and the suppressed pistol to clear the beach first. If we can secure the sand, we can establish a perimeter." They dropped the secondary anchor, a fluke style they had pulled from the Marlow, and let the Aegis settle. The transition from the boat to the land felt surreal. For over a year, Elias and Sarah had lived on a vibrating aluminum deck. Now, as they lowered the small inflatable dinghy, tucked under the Aegis's stern, the prospect of standing on unmoving earth felt like a dream. "I'm going first," Elias said, checking his 9mm. He'd fitted it with a high-end suppressor he'd scavenged months ago. "Sarah, stay on the Aegis. If the beach is a trap, I want the big guns cover me from the deck." "I'm coming with you," Aegis said, surprising him. She was holding a heavy medical bag and a flare gun. "I need to get to the resort's communications room. If there's a log, it'll be there." Elias nodded curtly. They rowed the dinghy in total silence. The water was so clear, they could see the ribs of a sunken sailboat on the lagoon floor, its mast reaching up like a skeletal hand. As the dinghy's hull hissed against the sand, 2 drowned detached themselves from the shade of a palm tree. They were wearing tattered Hawaiian shirts and faded swim trunks. Their skin was leathery and cracked from the island sun, their movements sluggish. "Phut! Phut!" The suppressed pistol coughed twice. The 2 figures folded into the sand before they could even let out a moan. "Check the perimeter," Elias whispered. They moved toward the main pavilion. The resort was eerily beautiful. Bougainvillea vines had overgrown the stone paths, their bright pink flowers contrasting with the skeletal remains of a guest lounging in a hammock. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and smelled of salt and stale coconut oil. Elias kept his weapon raised, clearing the corners of the bar and the concierge's desk. On the desk sat a leather-bound book, the guest registry. Beside it lay a handwritten journal, its pages curled by the humidity. Elias flipped it open. September 14th. "The radio says the cities are gone. We thought we were safe here. The currents are our walls. But this morning, the walls started walking. They aren't coming from the boats. They're coming out of the surf. Just drifting in with the tide, then standing up. There's too many of them in the water. We're moving to the high cliffs. They didn't stand a chance, Aegis muttered, looking at computer terminals. They were waiting for a rescue ship. They didn't realize the ocean was a conveyor belt for the infected. Elias looked out the glass windows at the Aegis. Their boat sat in a lagoon, a high-tech fortress of food and power. Then he looked at the resort. There were industrial kitchens here, rain catchment systems, solid walls. There aren't thousands of them, Elias said, a spark of hope finally lighting his eyes. There are maybe 200 on the whole island. Most are probably trapped in the guest rooms or the maintenance tunnels. You want to stay? Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. I want to finish it, Elias replied. If we clear this island, we have a home. We have the mountain on the boat to sustain us while we plant the seed kit. We can build a life here. Elias, Sarah's voice dropped. Look at the reef. Through the binoculars, the tide is turning. Elias ran to window. Outside, the incoming tide was bringing more than just water. In the surf, dozens of bobbing, gray heads were appearing. The ocean was delivering a fresh shipment of the dead. We need a fence, Elias said, gripping the journal. Not on land. In the water. Elias didn't wait for the new arrivals to find their footing. He knew the biology of the drowned now. They were heavy, clumsy, and slow until they reached dry sand. Aegis, get to the maintenance shed behind the lobby, Elias ordered. Look for anything that floats. Bumpers, old crab traps, mooring buoys. Anything. He sprinted back to the beach, his boots throwing up plumes of white sand. On the deck of the Aegis, Sarah had already positioned herself. She wasn't using the shotgun. She had the long-range bolt-action rifle they'd kept wrapped in oilcloth for a year. Crack! The sound echoed off the basalt cliffs. A figure in the surf, still waist-deep, slumped into the waves. I'll pick off the ones in the deep. Sarah yelled over the radio. You handle the ones on the flats. Elias worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency. He moved along the shoreline, putting a single suppressed round into the temple of every gray shape that tried to haul itself onto the island. It was a chore like weeding a garden, but the garden was made of ghosts. By the time the sun began to dip behind the cliffs, the beach was littered with silent forms. Dr. Aegis emerged from the maintenance shed, dragging a heavy industrial cart. It was loaded with coils of yellow polypropylene rope and dozens of large, orange foam buoys used for marking the resort's swimming boundaries. I found the sea fence supplies, Aegis panted. The resort had a shark net system. It's all in the shed, heavy-duty mesh and weighted anchors. Elias looked at the supplies, then at the lagoon. A plan began to take shape. We don't need a shark net. Sharks are smart. These things are just driftwood with teeth. Under the fading light, they began the most important modification of their lives. They utilized the Aegis as a tugboat. Elias and Sarah worked the deck, spooling out hundreds of feet of the yellow rope, while Aegis sat in the dinghy, clipping the orange buoys every 10 feet. They didn't create a solid wall. Instead, they created a series of V-shaped funnels around the mouth of the lagoon. To the bottom of the ropes, they didn't hang nets. They hung heavy-gauge fishing hooks and jagged pieces of scrap metal they'd scavenged from the resort's workshop. The zombie catch, Sarah called it. As the tide pushed the infected toward the shore, the current would funnel them into the apex of the V-lines. The hooks and the mesh wouldn't kill them, but it would snag their clothes and their bloated skin, tethering them in the deep water where they would hang, useless and drowning forever, beneath the surface. By midnight, the first line was set. They sat on the deck of the Aegis, the solar-powered floodlights illuminating the water. Splash. Clank. They watched as it drowned, drifting in from the open sea, hit the first line. The buoy bobbed violently. The creature struggled, its arms flailing, But the more it moved, the more the heavy-duty hook snagged its tattered shirt. It was pulled down by the weight of the anchor, its head disappearing beneath the turquoise water. The buoy settled, twitching occasionally, but the threat was neutralized. "It works," Sarah whispered, leaning her head on Elias's shoulder. "It's a start," Elias said. They spent the rest of the night clearing the resort's interior. They found the staff quarters, where a dozen more infected were locked in the laundry room. It was quick, silent work. By dawn, the Solstice Reef resort was quiet for the first time in years. Elias walked into the industrial kitchen. He flipped a switch on the wall. A low hum filled the room. "The resort has a dedicated solar thermal array on the roof," Aegis said, coming up behind him with her tablet. "It's separate from the main power. It's been charging for years. We have hot water, Elias. Real, pressurized hot water." Elias looked at his hands, calloused, stained with salt and grease. He looked out the window at the Aegis, still floating perfectly in the center of the lagoon, its mountain of food still half full. "We bring the gear up tomorrow," Elias said. "The tablet, the seeds, the med kits. We turn the lobby into our command center." He walked out to the balcony, overlooking the beach. The orange buoys of the sea fence bobbed in the morning light, a line of sentinels protecting their new world. "What about the radio?" Sarah asked, joining them. "The one in the communications room. Aegis said it's powerful enough to reach the mainland." Elias looked at the empty horizon. For a year, they had been ghosts. They had survived by being invisible. Now, they had a fortress. "We wait 1 month," Elias decided. "We plant the crops. We double the sea fence. We make sure this place is a grave for the dead, not us." He looked at the tablet in Sarah's hand, the library of 10,000 books. Then Elias said, "We start telling the others how to find the spire." Part 6, The Growing Season, Segment 1 of 2. The first 3 months on St. Jude's Spire were a blur of salt exhaustion. While the resort provided walls and roofs that didn't pitch and roll with the swells, the transition to land revealed a new set of vulnerabilities. On the Aegis, survival was about maintenance. On the Spire, survival was about transformation. Elias woke every morning at 5 o'clock, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the rhythmic thump slap of the sea fence buoys. He would sit on the balcony of the penthouse, now his command center, and scan the horizon with the long-range glass. The lagoon was clear, but the drowned were a constant tide. They didn't come in waves. They came in drips, 1 or 2 every few hours, snagging on the V-lines Elias had anchored. "The soil is dead, Elias," Sarah said on a sweltering Tuesday in the 2nd month. She was kneeling in the center of what used to be the resort's emerald green putting course. She had dug a trench 2 feet deep, revealing nothing but pale, sun-bleached sand and crushed coral. "We can plant the seeds from the kit, and they'll sprout. The internal energy of the seed will see to that, but they'll wither before they silk. There's no nitrogen, no carbon, no life." Elias joined her, looking at the tablet. They had 10,000 books, and now he filtered them for sustainable reclamation. He found a manual on island husbandry, written by a collective in the South Pacific. "We have to build the floor before we build the house," Elias said. "We start the sea drag tomorrow." The sea drag became their new ritual. Every morning, Elias would take the Aegis out past the breakers. He had rigged a wide, weighted rake made of rebar and PVC pipe. He would cruise the edges of the great sargassum mats, dragging tons of the golden brown weed back into the lagoon. It was back-breaking work. They had to haul the dripping, heavy kelp onto the beach using the Aegis's electric windlass. Once on the sand, the weed had to be rinsed. Salt was the enemy of the garden. They used the output from the resort's industrial solar stills, gallons of flat, distilled water, to wash the brine from the kelp. Then came the layering. Elias and Sarah used the resort's concrete decorative fountains as composting vats. They layered the rinsed seaweed with chopped palm fronds, kitchen scraps, and the one thing the ocean provided in abundance: fish guts. Every snapper or grouper they caught for dinner had its remains buried deep in the vats. By the third month, the fountains were no longer beautiful water features. They were steaming black pits of biological heat. The smell was intense, a mixture of ozone, rot, and deep earth. But to Sarah, it was a smell of the future. When she plunged her hand into the center of the first vat and pulled out a fistful of dark, crumbling humus, she looked at Elias with a grin. That was the first real piece of joy he'd seen in a year. "Black gold," she whispered. They began the terracing. The spire was steep, so they couldn't just plow a field, using the resort's stone walkway pavers. Elias built low retaining walls along the eastern slope, where the morning sun was strongest, but the salt spray was blocked by the cliffs. They filled these stone pockets with their spire soil, a few inches at a time. It was during the 5th month, just as the first corn stalks were reaching for sun, that the first test of their safe haven arrived. Elias was on the Aegis, scrubbing the solar panels, when a radio chirped, not the automated broadcast, but a live, panicked voice. "Mayday, mayday! This is a commercial trawler Osprey. We are dead in the water, 20 miles north of the Spire coordinates. We have an engine fire and our pumps are failing. We have 5 souls on board. Is anyone there?" Elias froze. He looked at the resort. Sarah was on the terrace, her back to the ocean. Dr. Aegis was in the infirmary, cataloging the last of the Marlowe's antibiotics. "Sarah, radio!" Elias roared. They gathered in the lounge, listening to the Osprey's crew. The trawler was a 60-foot steel-hulled beast. If it sank, 5 people died. If it reached the spire, their resources would be split 7 ways instead of 2. The mountain of food in the pantry suddenly looked very small. "If they have a trawler, they have tools," Sarah said, her mind already working on logistics. "They have winches. They have heavy-duty cable. Elias, the sea fence is fraying. We're using nylon rope to hold back 1,000 pounds of dead weight every day. If we have that ship's steel cable, we can make the fence permanent." "It's 20 miles," Elias cautioned. "The Aegis isn't a tugboat. Pushing the electric motors that hard for that long. We could fry the inverters. We could lose our only way off this rock." "We're not leaving the rock, Elias," Sarah said firmly. "This is the world now. We expand or we die." Elias didn't argue. He spent the next hour stripping the Aegis of every ounce of unnecessary weight. He emptied the freshwater tanks, moved the emergency kits to the pier, and checked the battery cooling systems. He reached the Osprey just as the sun was beginning to set. The trawler was a blackened husk, smoke still curling from the engine room vents. The 5 survivors were huddled on the bow. 2 grizzled sailors, a younger man with grease-stained hands, and a couple in their 30s. They looked at the Aegis like it was an apparition. The tow back was a nightmare of mechanical stress. The Aegis's motors hummed in a frequency Elias had never heard, a high, stress whine that made the deck plates vibrate. He watched the battery levels plummet, 80%, 60%, 40%. Every swell that hit the trawler's bow sent a shock wave through the tow line, jerking the Aegis back. "Hold together," Elias whispered, his hand on the throttle. "Just a few more miles." He brought them into the lagoon with 8% power remaining. The batteries were so hot he could smell the lithium cells. But the Osprey was moored. The integration was the first test of Elias's leadership. He didn't let them on the main island. "Not yet. The cabanas," Elias told the newcomers, pointing to the small, detached huts on the far end of the beach. 3 days. No exceptions. We provide the water and the food, but you stay behind the line. If you're clean after 72 hours, we talk about jobs. The sailors grumbled, but the mechanic, a man named Miller, looked at the solar panels on the resort roof and the green corn on the terrace. He nodded slowly. You got a good setup here, boss. We can wait. By the end of the week, the population of the Spire had more than tripled, and with Miller the mechanic, the Aegis was no longer the only piece of tech on the island. By the 7th month, the sea fence had been completely overhauled. Miller, using a makeshift underwater cutting torch powered by the Aegis's battery bank, had stripped the steel towing cables from the sunken engine room of the Osprey. They replaced a frayed nylon with 3/4-inch galvanized steel. The zombie catch was now a permanent fixture. Elias and the sailors spent their afternoons in the dinghy, reinforcing the V-shaped funnels. They didn't just use hooks anymore. They used the Osprey's industrial netting to create collection pockets underwater. It's not just about stopping them, Miller explained as they winched a particularly heavy line tight. It's about weight. The steel cable can handle 100 of those drown without snapping. We just let the current do the work. The 8th and 9th months brought the great canning. The corn and beans they had planted in the Spire soil had reached maturity, their stalks heavy and proud. But the heat of the tropical sun was a double-edged sword. The vegetables would rot within days, if not preserved. The jar ship arrived just in time. It was a sleek catamaran captained by a woman named Clara, who had been a logistics manager before the spill. She didn't come for rescue. She came to trade. In her hulls, she carried crates of mason jars, spare rubber seals, and, most importantly, 2 industrial-sized pressure canners. I heard your broadcast, Clara said, standing on the pier as her crew unloaded the glass. You said you needed the means to grow. I have the glass. You have the soil. We want a permanent berth and 10% of the winter yield. Elias didn't hesitate. Done. The resort's kitchen became a factory. The induction stoves, powered by the midday's solar peak, hissed and popped as the pressure canners worked through the harvest. Sarah oversaw the operation, her library tablet open to food safety guidelines. By the end of the 11th month, the resort's dry storage room, once a place for extra towels and mini-bar snacks, was filled with hundreds of jars of bright green beans, golden corn, and spicy pickled peppers. They had reached a state of stable equilibrium. They were no longer eating the Aegis's emergency rations. They were eating the island. The final month of the year began with a storm, a massive, howling Atlantic gale that tested every weld and every cable they had installed. For 3 days, the Spire was lashed by wind and rain. Elias stayed on the bridge of the Aegis, watching the sea fence buoys vanish on the swells and reappear, battered but holding. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared to a brilliant scrub blue. Elias walked out onto the balcony, expecting to see a clean horizon. Instead, he saw a mountain of steel. Elias, Sarah whispered, joining him. Look at the draft of that thing. It's huge. Coming out of the morning mist was a mid-sized cargo feeder ship, the Mariner's Hope. It wasn't drifting. It was under a slow, rhythmic power, its bow cutting through the water with agonizing slowness. It sat incredibly low in the water, as if it were carrying the weight of the world. As it drew closer to the Spire's lagoon, the scale of the arrival became clear. On its deck were dozens of standard 20-foot shipping containers TUs, stacked 3 high. Elias and Miller met the ship at the outer marker. A man in a faded merchant marine uniform stood at the railing, shouting over a megaphone. We saw your lights. We heard the signal. We've been running on a skeleton crew and prayers since the Savannah ports fell. What are you carrying? Elias yelled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Everything we could grab before the gate went down, the captain roared. We have 6 containers of grade A monocrystalline solar panels, 3 containers of vacuum-sealed winter clothing. And the rest? He paused, a grin breaking through his salt-stained beard. The rest are full of bulk non-perishables. Grain, salt, sugar, and dried protein. We have enough supplies to feed 1,000 people for 5 years, but we have nowhere to put them down. Elias looked at the massive steel boxes, then back at the spire. The mountain of food they had started with on the Aegis was a pebble compared to the avalanche of resources now entering their lagoon. Miller, Elias said, his voice thick with the realization of what this meant. Get the winch ready on the pier. We're going to need a bigger garden. The Aegis led the giant ship into the harbor. As the first shipping container was winched onto the concrete dock, the metal boomed with a sound like a starting gun. They weren't just a colony anymore. With the steel, the power, and the mountain supplies, they were the capital of a new world. Elias stood on the deck of the Aegis, watching the sunrise catch the edge of a solar panel container. The year of survival was over. The era of the spire had begun.